Jasmine Crockett was halfway through her second cup of coffee when the phone rang. "This is D.C. Metro Police calling. We have a harassment complaint filed against you," the voice said matter-of-factly. The name that followed left her stunned. Barron Trump. An 18-year-old had called the police because she criticized his mother's luxury parties on live television. The interview on Inside the Beltway was supposed to be routine, another discussion about federal budget transparency that would fade into the background noise of Washington politics. But Representative Jasmine Crockett had arrived at the studio with a manila folder full of documents that would change everything. She sat across from host David Richardson in the familiar setting of the show's Washington studio, her navy blazer pressed to perfection, her expression carrying the calm determination of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The folder rested on the table beside her, innocuous to anyone watching, but containing information that would soon send shockwaves through the highest levels of American government. "Congresswoman Crockett," Richardson began, adjusting his glasses and consulting his notes, "you've been vocal about the need for greater transparency in federal spending. What specific areas concern you most?" Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the measured tone that had become her trademark in committee hearings and public appearances. "David, let me be very direct about something that should concern every American taxpayer. When we're cutting school lunch programs and slashing funding for veteran services, we need to ask some hard questions about other spending priorities." She reached for the folder with deliberate precision, opening it to reveal a stack of documents organized with the meticulous care of someone who had spent years building legal cases in courtrooms across Texas. "I'm talking about taxpayer dollars being used to fund extravagant private events at Mar-a-Lago," she continued, her voice remaining perfectly level. "Designer caviar while children go hungry, imported orchids while teachers buy their own classroom supplies, crystal table settings that cost more than most families make in a year." Richardson shifted in his seat, sensing that this was no longer a routine budget discussion. "Congresswoman, are you referring to official state functions, or—" "I'm referring to documented expenditures tied to the First Lady's office," Jasmine interrupted, holding up a receipt with official government letterhead. "This invoice shows $23,000 spent on crystal table settings for what was described as a private diplomatic reception. This one shows $17,000 for a gelato bar for a birthday celebration, and this," she held up another document, "shows $137,000 for what's listed as decorative floral ambiance for a single evening event." The studio fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the cameras and the barely audible rustle of papers as Jasmine arranged the documents with practiced efficiency. "These aren't state dinners or official diplomatic functions," she continued, her voice gaining strength without losing its composed delivery. "These are private parties funded by taxpayer dollars while essential government services face budget cuts." Richardson recovered his composure, leaning forward with the instincts of a journalist who recognized a major story developing in real time. "Congresswoman, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence that these expenditures were inappropriate or illegal?" Jasmine's response was measured and precise. "I have documented evidence of a pattern of questionable spending tied to the First Lady's office. When families are choosing between rent and medical bills, when teachers are working second jobs to survive, when veterans are waiting months for basic health care, we cannot justify spending taxpayer money on luxury parties." She held up another document. "This internal memo from a junior staffer in the First Lady's office warns that certain charges may raise public concern if reviewed closely. They knew these expenditures were problematic, and they proceeded anyway." The interview continued for another 12 minutes, with Jasmine methodically presenting evidence and Richardson asking increasingly pointed questions. But the damage, or the truth, depending on your perspective, was already done. Within minutes of the segment airing, clips were being shared across social media platforms, and by the time Jasmine left the studio, her phone was buzzing with calls from reporters, colleagues, and political observers who recognized they had just witnessed something significant. Back in her Capitol Hill apartment that evening, Jasmine sat at her kitchen table reviewing the day's events with her chief of staff, Ava DeWitt. The interview clip had already surpassed 2 million views across various platforms, and the hashtags #Taxpayer dollars and #Mar-a-Lago spending were trending nationally. The responses are intense, Ava reported, scrolling through her tablet. Conservative outlets are calling it an unprovoked attack on the First Lady. Liberal commentators are praising your transparency, but some are worried about the political risks of going after Melania directly. Jasmine nodded, unsurprised by the polarized reaction. What about the documents? Are people actually looking at the evidence, or are they just reacting to headlines? That's the interesting part, Ava replied. People are actually fact-checking this time. Screenshots of the budget documents are being shared, threads on social media are breaking down the expense reports, and several watchdog organizations have already reached out asking for copies of the full documentation. Jasmine felt a small surge of satisfaction. This was exactly what she had hoped for, not partisan political theater, but genuine public engagement with the actual facts of government spending. There's something else, Ava continued, her expression becoming more serious. We're getting some pushback from unexpected quarters. Someone from the Trump organization has been calling news outlets, trying to get them to retract or clarify coverage of the interview. On what grounds? Jasmine asked. They're claiming the expenditures were either mischaracterized or taken out of context. But here's the thing. They're not actually denying the amounts or the events. They're just arguing about the interpretation. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, processing this information. In her years as a trial attorney, she had learned that when opposing counsel focused on interpretation rather than facts, it usually meant the facts were solid. What's our next move? Ava asked. We stick to the evidence, Jasmine replied. If they want to challenge our interpretation, they're welcome to release their own documentation. Transparency works both ways. She had no way of knowing that at that very moment, 18-year-old Barron Trump was in his room at the White House residence, scrolling through social media comments about his mother and growing increasingly agitated about what he perceived as unfair attacks on his family. The next morning brought the phone call that would transform a policy disagreement into a national controversy. Jasmine was in her congressional office, reviewing committee notes and preparing for a busy day of meetings when her office landline rang. Ava answered with her usual professional demeanor. Congresswoman Crockett's office, this is Ava speaking. There was a pause, and Jasmine watched as Ava's expression shifted from routine politeness to confusion. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? Yes, hold on, please. Ava covered the receiver and turned to Jasmine with an expression that mixed disbelief with concern. It's someone from the D.C. Metro Police. They're asking to speak with you directly about a complaint that's been filed. Jasmine felt a brief flutter of concern but maintained her composure. In her years in public service, she had received all kinds of calls from law enforcement, some routine, some serious, but none that had particularly alarmed her. Put them through, she said calmly. This is Representative Crockett. Good morning, ma'am. This is Sergeant DeLuca with the D.C. Metropolitan Police. We received a report last night regarding a harassment complaint filed against you. Jasmine blinked slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. Harassment? She had given a televised interview about public spending. How could that possibly constitute harassment? I'm sorry. What exactly are you referring to? She asked. Yes, ma'am. A harassment complaint. The complainant is a Mr. Barron Trump. He alleges that your televised remarks targeted his mother and posed a security concern for his family. For a moment, Jasmine was genuinely speechless. She looked across her office at Ava, who was watching with growing concern, and tried to process what she had just heard. Sergeant, she said slowly, are you telling me that an 18-year-old filed a police report because I gave a televised interview about government spending? There was a brief pause before Sergeant DeLuca responded. That's correct, ma'am. I want to be clear that this isn't an official charge at this time, but because of the complainant's status and the nature of his concerns, we were required to log the incident and notify your office. Jasmine felt a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been amusement if the situation weren't so absurd. And what exactly did Mr. Trump claim I did that constituted harassment? According to the report, he alleges that your public statements about his mother's activities were intended to incite public hostility and created a security risk for his family. Jasmine rubbed her temple, feeling the beginnings of what promised to be a very long day. Sergeant, I gave a public interview about publicly funded activities. That's literally part of my job as an elected representative. Yes, ma'am, I understand. Like I said, this isn't a formal charge. We're just required to follow protocol when complaints are filed, especially given the high-profile nature of the parties involved. Is there anything else you need from me? Jasmine asked. No, ma'am. We'll close the file unless additional complaints are filed. I apologize for any inconvenience. Jasmine hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, staring at the stack of budget documents on her desk. Ava waited quietly, recognizing that her boss needed a moment to process what had just happened. Well, Jasmine finally said, this is a new one. What the hell was that about? Ava asked. Barron Trump, Jasmine replied, shaking her head, filed a harassment complaint because I said his mother throws expensive parties with taxpayer money. That can't be real. It is, and now, thanks to police protocol, there's a harassment report in the system with my name on it. Ava sat down heavily. Do you think it was really him, or did someone put him up to it? Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She had learned in her legal career that motivations were often less important than consequences, and the consequences of this particular phone call were about to spiral far beyond what an 18-year-old could have imagined. It took less than an hour for the story to leak. A local political blog with sources in law enforcement broke the news first. Breaking, Barron Trump files, harassment complaint against Reaper Jasmine Crockett. The story cited law enforcement sources, which probably meant someone with access to police records had forwarded a screenshot to a reporter. By noon, the story had been picked up by major outlets. The Daily Journal ran with, First Son accuses Congresswoman of harassment over Melania comments. Capital Lens followed with, Trump family fights back against Crockett's spending allegations. But it was the conservative news cycle that truly exploded. On television, red-faced pundits seized on the story with obvious glee. What kind of grown woman goes after the First Lady and gets her teenage son involved in police calls? Shouted one commentator. This is what political extremism looks like in 2025. The coverage conveniently omitted several key facts: that Barron had initiated the police contact, not Jasmine, that Jasmine had never reached out to the Trump family directly, and that her comments had been focused on documented government expenditures, not personal attacks. But facts, Jasmine was learning, had a way of getting lost in the initial wave of outrage and interpretation. At 1:15 p.m., Jasmine stepped outside her Capitol Hill office to face a small crowd of reporters who had gathered after news of the police complaint broke. She had considered avoiding the press entirely, but Ava had convinced her that silence would only fuel more speculation. Congresswoman, a reporter called out as soon as she appeared. Are you planning to apologize to the Trump family for your comments? Jasmine looked directly into the cameras, her expression calm and professional. I have not once reached out to the Trump family in any personal capacity. My comments were directed at a pattern of questionable spending that affects American taxpayers. That oversight function is part of my job as an elected representative. Another journalist shouted, Congresswoman, are you accusing the Trump family of retaliating against you? I'm stating a fact, Jasmine replied evenly. When a sitting member of Congress makes public observations based on publicly funded activities, that's not harassment, that's oversight. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't smile or show any emotion beyond professional composure. When another reporter asked if she would be apologizing, she simply said no and returned to her office. Behind her, Ava was already drafting a statement for immediate release, designed to get ahead of the news cycle before the story could be spun further. What Jasmine didn't expect was the wave of support that began building almost immediately after her brief press conference. It started quietly, in group chats, Instagram stories, and comment sections of news articles, but quickly grew into something much larger. The support wasn't just coming from traditional political allies. Young people who rarely paid attention to budget hearings were sharing the interview clip. Teachers were posting about classroom supply shortages. Veterans were talking about wait times for medical care. People who typically avoided political discussions were suddenly engaged with questions about government spending and accountability. The viral response took several forms. Fact-checkers began creating detailed threads breaking down the expense reports Jasmine had cited. Screenshots of budget documents appeared across social media platforms. Watchdog organizations that had been quietly tracking government spending suddenly found themselves with massive new audiences interested in their work. Perhaps most powerfully, the story began resonating with anyone who had ever been told they were out of line for asking legitimate questions. The image of an 18-year-old calling the police because a congresswoman had criticized government spending struck many people as absurd and emblematic of larger problems with accountability and privilege. On Twitter, the hashtag #StandWithCrockett began trending alongside #Taxpayer dollars. On TikTok, users created videos comparing the cost of Melania's reported party expenses to things like teacher salaries, veterans' benefits, and school lunch programs. On Instagram, celebrities and influencers began sharing Jasmine's original interview with captions about government accountability. But perhaps the most significant response came from unexpected quarters. A former social worker from Tulsa uploaded a raw, unfiltered video that captured something many people were feeling, but hadn't quite articulated. She said what we've all been thinking, and now they're calling the cops on her for what? For doing her job while black? For asking questions while female? For demanding accountability while representing people who actually worry about paying their bills? That video alone received over 800,000 likes in 12 hours and was shared by people across political and demographic lines. While public opinion was rapidly shifting in Jasmine's favor, the atmosphere inside the White House was increasingly tense. In the East Wing, First Lady Melania Trump stood near the tall windows of her private office, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Her chief of staff, Annetta Kohler, approached carefully with a draft statement in hand. "We've prepared a response, but it's risky. Anything we release now might reignite the story and draw more attention to the spending allegations." Melania didn't turn around. "I told him not to react," she said quietly. Annetta nodded. "He's young. He thought he was protecting you." Melania turned sharply. "Protecting me from what? From a congresswoman asking questions about public spending?" No one in the room responded to that. Behind the scenes, the Trump inner circle was scrambling. Donors had started calling with concerns. A few Senate allies had privately expressed discomfort with the situation. One had even suggested publicly distancing themselves from the incident altogether. The problem wasn't Jasmine's allegations. Those could potentially be explained or contextualized. The problem was the police report. Every time a spokesperson tried to shift the conversation back to policy disagreements, reporters brought up the harassment complaint. Every attempt at damage control only made the 18-year-old's decision look more questionable. Meanwhile, Barron Trump had largely disappeared from public view. According to sources close to the family, he had expected his complaint to be handled quietly and was unprepared for the media firestorm that followed. What he had intended as a protective gesture for his mother had instead become a source of embarrassment and ridicule. On social media, satirical accounts pretending to be his legal representation had gained hundreds of thousands of followers. Memes featuring his photo alongside captions like, "Karen asked to speak to the manager, I called the cops," were being shared millions of times. By Friday morning, Jasmine had decided that the only way to move past the noise and speculation was to release everything. She was tired of debates about her motivations or her tone. She wanted the public to see the evidence for themselves. "We're releasing the full documentation," she told Ava during their morning meeting. "No summaries, no interpretations, no spin. Just the raw evidence." Ava hesitated. "That's going to make some very powerful people very nervous." "Good," Jasmine replied. "They should be nervous." That afternoon, her team uploaded a comprehensive PDF to the congressional website titled "Expense Records Related to the Office of the First Lady, Oversight Subcommittee Review." The document included redacted receipts, itemized service invoices, and internal memos covering 2 fiscal quarters of spending tied to Melania's office. The documents were dry and technical, but they were also damning. One showed a payment request for $137,000 labeled as Decorative Floral Ambiance for a single evening event at Mar-a-Lago. Another detailed $23,000 in charges for crystal table settings that had been shipped directly to the Trump property. A third documented the $17,000 spent on what was described as a custom gelato service experience for a private birthday celebration. Perhaps most damaging was an internal memo from a junior staffer that warned certain charges may raise public concern if reviewed closely. The memo was dated 3 months before Jasmine's interview, proving that people within the administration had been aware of potential problems with the spending patterns. But Jasmine saved the most powerful evidence for last. Her office released the complete call logs from both her office phones and her personal cell phone for the 48 hours before and after her television interview. The log showed no calls, texts, or emails to or from anyone in the Trump family, their legal representatives, or the White House. "Let's be clear," Jasmine said in a brief video statement released alongside the documents. "There was no contact, no private communication, no campaign to harass anyone. I did my job openly, in public, based on documented evidence. What came next was not my choice." The release of the full documentation had an immediate impact that went beyond social media trends and cable news debates. The House Oversight Committee announced that it would conduct a formal review of discretionary spending tied to the First Lady's office. The announcement was made quietly, without fanfare, but its implications were significant. Committee Chairman Robert Hayes, a moderate Republican who had generally avoided confrontations with the Trump administration, released a carefully worded statement. Given the public interest in these expenditures and the detailed documentation that has been made available, the committee believes a formal review is appropriate to ensure proper stewardship of taxpayer dollars. The statement was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Even Republicans were uncomfortable defending the spending patterns that Jasmine had exposed. Behind the scenes, the review process began immediately. Auditors were assigned to examine not just the specific expenses Jasmine had highlighted, but the broader patterns of spending tied to Mar-a-Lago events and First Lady office activities. Within a week, additional information began to surface. A junior staffer in the First Lady's office abruptly resigned with no public explanation. Another was quietly reassigned to a regional advisory capacity with significantly reduced responsibilities. When pressed by reporters, White House officials described these as routine internal adjustments, but no one was fooled. More significantly, anonymous sources began providing additional documentation to both congressional investigators and journalists. One leaked memo suggested that Melania's staff had advised Barron against filing the police complaint, warning that exposure risk is high, outcome unpredictable. Another revealed that the White House counsel's office had conducted its own internal review of the spending patterns 6 months earlier and had recommended enhanced oversight protocols that were apparently never implemented. As the immediate political controversy continued to unfold, something deeper was happening in American culture. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and the Trump family had become a flashpoint for larger conversations about power, privilege, accountability, and who was allowed to ask difficult questions without facing retaliation. The incident had particular resonance for Black women who recognized familiar patterns in the attempts to characterize Jasmine as aggressive or out of line for doing her job. Social media filled with videos and posts from Black women sharing their own experiences of being penalized for speaking up, asking questions, or demanding accountability in professional settings. But the support extended far beyond any single demographic group. Teachers posted photos of their overcrowded classrooms with captions asking why crystal table settings were prioritized over educational resources. Veterans shared stories about delayed medical care, while luxury gelato bars received immediate funding. Parents talked about choosing between school supplies and rent, while watching government officials spend thousands on imported flowers. The phrase, "public funds are for the public," which Jasmine had posted on her Instagram account, became a rallying cry for advocates of government transparency and fiscal responsibility. Universities began incorporating the incident into courses on political communication, government ethics, and media literacy. High school civics teachers used it as a case study in how democratic oversight was supposed to work. Perhaps most significantly, the incident sparked renewed interest in government transparency and accountability among young people who had previously shown little engagement with traditional political processes. 6 months after Jasmine's television interview, the impacts were still reverberating through American politics and culture. The House Oversight Committee's review had resulted in new guidelines for spending tied to the First Lady's office, requiring greater documentation and approval processes for events held at private properties. Melania Trump had largely withdrawn from public view, making only minimal appearances at official functions. Her staff had been quietly restructured, with several longtime associates replaced by officials with backgrounds in government ethics and financial oversight. Barron Trump had learned a hard lesson about the consequences of public actions. The police complaint, which he had intended as a protective gesture, had instead become a source of ongoing embarrassment and had complicated his family's efforts to defend their practices. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on Jasmine Crockett herself. The incident had transformed her from a freshman Congresswoman into a national figure known for her willingness to ask difficult questions and demand accountability regardless of who might be offended. Speaking engagements poured in from universities, civic organizations, and professional associations. Publishers approached her about writing a book about government transparency. Political observers began discussing her as potential Senate or even presidential material. But Jasmine remained focused on the work that had brought her to Congress in the first place. In subsequent interviews, she consistently redirected attention away from the personal drama and toward the policy questions that had motivated her original investigation. "This was never about any individual or family," she said during one television appearance. "It was about ensuring that public resources are used for public purposes. If that makes some people uncomfortable, they should ask themselves why." A year later, Jasmine was invited to speak at Georgetown University's School of Public Policy about government oversight and accountability. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and members of the public who wanted to hear from the Congresswoman who had demonstrated how a single well-researched television interview could spark national change. During the question and answer session, a student asked about the personal cost of speaking truth to power, referencing the harassment complaint and the media attacks that had followed her investigation. Jasmine's response was measured and thoughtful. The personal cost of staying silent would have been much higher. When you're elected to represent people who are struggling to pay their bills, you have an obligation to ask hard questions about how their tax dollars are being spent. If that creates controversy, so be it. Another student asked whether she had been surprised by the level of support her investigation had generated. "I think people were hungry for someone to simply tell the truth about government spending," she replied. "Not spin, not talking points, not partisan attacks, just facts. When you present documented evidence and let people draw their own conclusions, you're often surprised by how much common ground exists." The event was live-streamed and viewed by hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom shared clips on social media with messages about civic engagement and the importance of holding government accountable. 3 years after the interview that changed everything, the Mar-a-Lago spending controversy had become a case study in how transparency, persistence, and careful documentation could create lasting change in American government. The spending guidelines implemented after Jasmine's investigation had saved taxpayers millions of dollars by requiring greater oversight of events held at private properties. The precedent she established had inspired other members of Congress to conduct similar investigations into questionable government expenditures. More importantly, her approach, methodical research, clear presentation of facts, and calm persistence in the face of attacks had become a model for effective government oversight. The harassment complaint that Barron Trump had filed in a moment of youthful indignation had become a symbol of how power often responds to accountability with intimidation rather than explanation. The fact that it had backfired so completely had sent a message that such tactics were no longer effective in an era of social media transparency and public engagement. Jasmine Crockett continued to serve in Congress, where she was now chair of the Government Oversight Subcommittee on Federal Spending. Her manila folders full of carefully organized documents had become legendary among her colleagues, and her phrase, "public funds are for the public," had been adopted by transparency advocates around the world. In quiet moments, she sometimes reflected on how a single television interview had changed not just her own career, but the broader conversation about government accountability in America. The 18-year-old who had called the police in an attempt to protect his mother had inadvertently helped strengthen the very oversight mechanisms he had tried to undermine. It was, Jasmine thought, a perfect example of how democracy was supposed to work. Transparency leading to accountability, facts trumping privilege, and the public interest prevailing over private comfort. The manila folder that had started it all sat in a place of honor in her office, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a democracy is simply the truth, carefully documented and clearly presented. And somewhere in America, young people were learning that asking hard questions wasn't harassment, it was citizenship. Public funds are for the public. If that makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why. Representative Jasmine Crockett. The Mar-a-Lago spending controversy didn't remain contained within American borders. International media outlets, initially puzzled by the story of a teenage son filing police complaints about government oversight, soon recognized the broader implications for democratic accountability worldwide. The BBC ran a detailed analysis titled, "When Transparency Meets Privilege: The Crockett Case Study." The piece noted that Jasmine's methodical approach to presenting evidence had created a template for government oversight that was being studied by transparency advocates across Europe. What's remarkable about Representative Crockett's approach, wrote political analyst Dr. Sarah Melbourne for The Guardian, is not just what she revealed, but how she revealed it. In an era of partisan accusations and Twitter diplomacy, she demonstrated that careful documentation and calm presentation of facts could still cut through political noise. The story gained particular traction in countries where government transparency was an ongoing struggle. In Brazil, where corruption scandals had dominated political discourse for years, Jasmine's phrase, "public funds are for the public," was translated and adopted by anti-corruption activists. In South Korea, student groups studying democratic accountability used her interview as an example of effective legislative oversight. Perhaps most significantly, the incident was discussed at the annual International Transparency Conference in Geneva, where government watchdog organizations from 43 countries analyzed the techniques Jasmine had used and the institutional responses her investigation had generated. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Director of Global Transparency Initiative, noted in her conference presentation, "The Crockett model demonstrates how individual accountability efforts can create systemic change when supported by transparent institutions and an engaged public." Behind the scenes, political psychologists and behavioral experts were fascinated by the dynamics that had played out between Jasmine and the Trump family. Dr. Michael Chen, a professor of political psychology at Stanford, published a paper analyzing what he called defensive privilege response patterns in high-profile political conflicts. What we observed in the Trump family's reaction to Representative Crockett's investigation was a textbook example of how entrenched power structures respond to legitimate oversight, Dr. Chen wrote. The progression from dismissal to personal attack to institutional intimidation follows predictable patterns that we've seen in authoritarian contexts worldwide. The paper gained attention not just in academic circles, but among leadership development professionals who recognized the broader applications of Dr. Chen's analysis. Corporate boards, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies began incorporating case studies of the Crockett investigation into their ethics training programs. One particularly striking element that Dr. Chen highlighted was the role of Barron Trump's police complaint in ultimately strengthening the very oversight mechanisms it was intended to undermine. The harassment complaint backfired so completely because it highlighted the absurdity of treating legitimate government oversight as a personal attack, Dr. Chen explained in a subsequent interview. It forced the public to consider whether asking questions about taxpayer spending should really be considered harassment, and the answer was overwhelmingly no. Perhaps nowhere was the long-term impact of Jasmine's investigation more evident than in American classrooms, where teachers were using the controversy as a real-time lesson in civics, ethics, and democratic participation. At Roosevelt High School in Phoenix, Arizona, government teacher Maria Santos, no relation to the teacher from Houston mentioned in earlier stories, had restructured her entire curriculum around what she called the Crockett method of civic engagement. Students today are naturally skeptical of political institutions, Santos explained to a local education reporter. But Representative Crockett showed them that the system can work when people are willing to do the research, present facts clearly, and persist despite opposition. Her students had spent a semester conducting their own oversight projects, examining everything from school district spending to city council budgeting decisions. One group had discovered that their district was spending significantly more per student on administrative costs than neighboring districts with better academic outcomes. Another had identified inefficiencies in municipal waste management that were costing taxpayers thousands of dollars annually. The students learned that asking hard questions isn't disrespectful, Santos noted. It's responsible citizenship. The approach was being replicated in schools across the country. The National Council for Social Studies had even developed a formal curriculum guide based on Jasmine's investigation techniques, complete with research methodologies, evidence organization systems, and presentation strategies. But perhaps the most powerful impact was on the students themselves. Exit surveys from schools using the Crockett method showed significantly higher rates of civic engagement, with students reporting increased likelihood to vote, attend local government meetings, and consider careers in public service. Economists and budget policy experts had been watching the fallout from Jasmine's investigation with particular interest, not just because of the specific spending she had identified, but because of the broader questions her work raised about fiscal oversight and resource allocation. Dr. Robert Hayes, a public finance professor at the University of Chicago, no relation to the House Oversight Committee chairman, published a comprehensive analysis of the economic implications of the Mar-a-Lago spending patterns in the Journal of Public Economics. The amounts Representative Crockett identified, while significant in absolute terms, represent a tiny fraction of overall federal spending, Dr. Hayes wrote. However, their symbolic importance is enormous because they highlight fundamental questions about priorities and accountability that apply to much larger budget categories. His analysis showed that the $137,000 spent on decorative floral ambiance for a single event was equivalent to 2,740 school lunches for low-income students, healthcare costs for 23 veterans for 1 month, educational supplies for 14 underserved classrooms for an entire school year, housing assistance for 3 homeless families for 6 months. These comparisons, which Dr. Hayes presented in clear infographics, were widely shared on social media and helped crystallize public understanding of the opportunity costs associated with luxury government spending. When taxpayers see these kinds of direct comparisons, Dr. Hayes explained in a subsequent interview, it becomes much harder to justify discretionary spending on luxury items while essential services remain underfunded. Legal scholars were equally interested in the precedents established by Jasmine's investigation and the institutional responses it had generated. The harassment complaint, filed by Barron Trump, while ultimately unsuccessful, had raised important questions about the boundaries of protected political speech and the use of law enforcement in political disputes. Professor Jennifer Walsh at Harvard Law School, coincidentally sharing a name with the teacher from Michigan mentioned earlier, published a detailed analysis of the legal implications in the Harvard Law Review. The Trump vs. Crockett incident, as legal historians may eventually call it, established several important precedents about the scope of legislative oversight and the limits of retaliation against elected officials, Professor Walsh wrote. Her analysis noted that the quick dismissal of the harassment complaint had effectively strengthened protections for government oversight activities, making it more difficult for future administrations to use law enforcement threats to intimidate critics. The coverage of Jasmine's investigation had also revealed important changes in how political stories develop and spread in the social media age. Traditional media outlets, which had initially struggled to keep pace with the rapid evolution of the story across digital platforms, had been forced to adapt their coverage strategies. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a media studies professor at Columbia University, had been tracking the coverage patterns and published her findings in the Columbia Journalism Review. The Crockett story demonstrated how traditional gatekeeping functions in journalism have been transformed by social media, Dr. Rodriguez wrote. The story's viral spread on platforms like TikTok and Twitter actually forced traditional outlets to cover it more thoroughly and accurately than they might have otherwise. Her analysis showed that fact-checking and verification efforts had increased significantly as outlets competed to provide the most accurate and comprehensive coverage. The abundance of primary source documents that Jasmine had released had made it easier for journalists to verify claims and harder for partisan outlets to distort the basic facts. The Mar-a-Lago investigation represents a significant example of how democratic oversight mechanisms can function effectively even in highly polarized political environments, the report noted. Representative Crockett's methodical approach and sustained focus on evidence over rhetoric created space for public engagement across traditional political divisions. The report was being used by democracy promotion organizations in countries where government transparency remained limited. In several Eastern European nations, civil society groups had translated and distributed Jasmine's methodology as a guide for conducting oversight of their own governments. The impact extended beyond formal oversight activities. In countries where asking questions of government officials carried personal risks, Jasmine's example had inspired more cautious but still meaningful transparency efforts. She showed that you don't need to be confrontational to be effective, explained one democracy advocate working in Eastern Europe. Sometimes the most powerful approach is simply to present facts clearly and let the public draw their own conclusions. The ripple effects of a single television interview, carefully prepared and professionally delivered, continued to spread across continents and cultures, proving that democracy's most powerful tools remained unchanged: transparency, accountability, and the persistent pursuit of truth. Even as political winds shifted and news cycles moved on to other controversies, the precedents established by Jasmine Crockett's investigation continued to shape how government oversight was conducted, how evidence was presented, and how citizens engaged with the democratic process. The manila folder that had started it all had become a symbol not just of one Congresswoman's dedication to accountability, but of democracy's enduring capacity for self-correction when citizens refused to accept easy answers to hard questions.